Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today I want to talk about rapid onset gender dysphoria in boys. Specifically, I want to talk about this article by Joe Burgo, who's done a lot of work in this space in gender critical circles. He's given talks like Gen Spec and other things, and a lot of what he talks about is this concept of a third way. So, in the classic Blanchardian typology, there's sort of two types of transsexual males. There's your homosexual type and your autogynephilic type. And he wants to propose that there is a third type, a third way in which males become trans identified, and that is through what he calls rapid onset gender dysphoria. Um, so he starts off with this article that was recently published called The Perfect Storm, talking about Lisa Littman's hypothesis of ROGD, or rapid onset gender dysphoria, in females, in like young girls. And that's kind of like a well-known narrative in regards to that. And I would classify that as a hypothesis that has tentative evidence. And then there's this question of like, okay, well, if young adolescent females are sort of developing this rapid onset gender dysphoria, is there an equivalent in young males? And he says the increasing number of gender distressed boys is more challenging to explain and involves a perfect storm of psychological vulnerability colliding with the cultural zeitgeist and new technologies. In brief, I believe that a generation of sensitive, awkward, and often highly intelligent boys is coming of age at a time when gender identity ideologies suffuses the education system, social media, and online discussion forums, and when the cultural conversation around toxic masculinity and the patriarchy has been made growing up to be an oppressor seem repellent. So yeah, he's talking about the RGD hypothesis in young females, and he's saying that there's like a growing rate of boys that are identifying as trans as well. What explains that? And then he gets into the Blanchardian typology. So Blanchard split between homosexual transsexuals, that is, men exclusively attracted to other men and who had exhibited feminine behavior appearance from an early age. And then autogynephilic transsexuals, heterosexual men who experience sexual arousal at the thought or image of themselves as female. According to people like Phil Illey, roughly around 80% of trans women in the Western world are of the AGP type. So Michael Bailey, who's a researcher who studied autogynephilia, has commented on the rapid rise of boys being identified as trans. And Bailey said he believes this typology still holds true for the dramatically increased number of boys and men seeking to transition. Male adolescents are youth, and they're seeking gender transition, and most of them are probably AGP. So Burgo says, as a psychotherapist working primarily with gender distressed males, I've of course encountered both HSTS and AGPs as clients in my practice. I know they continue to show up at gender clinics for hormones and SRS, probably in the same relative proportions as before. But there's a new cohort that doesn't conform to the Blanchard typology. And in the pages ahead, I'll attempt to describe and account for this new phenomenon, this third way into trans identification. My views have evolved in part from my private psychotherapy practice working with trans-identified teenage boys, detransitioned males who realized too late post-surgery that they were gay, and men who struggle with autogynephilia. So there's this website out there called ROGD Boys that talks about this new phenomenon, the boy profile. And I'm very skeptical of this RGD boys phenomenon. I think this is basically just like AGP. And I'll explain why. Because if you look at this profile of these RGD boys, so For the most part, they don't display signs of early gender nonconformity. Okay, that's classic AGP. Most AGPs were not super feminine. That's what distinguishes them. That's what distinguishes them from the HSTS is they don't show early signs of gender nonconformity. Um, so they've always been quirky and sensitive. They might have had difficulty fitting in with their peer group from an early age, experiencing intense social anxiety and isolation. Some of them were bullied for their differences. Okay, that is not incompatible with AGP because if you spend time hanging out with trans women, particularly the AGP type, as I have extensively, they're very awkward. They're very nerdy, quirky, and insensitive. That is like classic transbian. The transbian, the lesbian AGPs, the lesbian trans women, they're very quirky and sensitive. That's just what it is. But that's not incompatible with them being AGP. Prior to identifying as transgender, they likely struggle with one or more mental health issues, such as anxiety or depression. Sometimes a traumatic or deeply stressful event occurred immediately prior to their coming out. Again, that's not incompatible with AGP. Many of these boys are highly intelligent, gifted, or exceptionally creative. Many have autism spectrum disorder or may exhibit traits of neurodivergence, such as hypersensitivity to environmental stimuli, issues with interoception, difficulty reading social cues, or managing strong emotions. Again, that's not incompatible with AGP. Like many transbians, trans women who are of the AGP ideology, they are on the autism spectrum and they're highly intelligent, gifted, or creative. This idea that if you are on the autism spectrum, that somehow that like means you're not AGP or that like is evidence for a third type. No, that's not true because we already know that most trans women, like there's already well known a strong correlation between being a trans woman and being on the autism spectrum. Well, on the AGP hypothesis, the majority of trans women are AGP. So these are not like contradictory statements. And furthermore, just like I know this isn't like a scientific poll or anything, but if you look on the Ask AGP subreddit, how many of us are autistic? The vast majority are diagnosed as autistic, self-diagnosed as autistic, or suspecting that I may be autistic out of 76 votes. So of the people who are self-aware as AGP, the majority are, you know, are on the spectrum. And then if you go to the M to F subreddit, which is one of the most biggest forums for like trans women on the internet, and these are trans women who are Redditors. Redditors are known to be quirky, intelligent, sensitive, nerdy boys. And then you have trans women who are Redditors. That's the same demographic of like quirky, nerdy, sensitive, nerdy boys. And then on the M to F subreddit, it's how many of us are autistic. And pretty much every single comment on here is like the top comment, I've only met like 2 or 3 non-autistic trans girls. On this sub, we're the vast minority. So the non-autistic are the vast minority. And pretty much everyone on this subreddit, most of them are on the spectrum. Okay, so most of the trans Redditors on the internet are autistic. Well, what else do you find on the M to F subreddit? You find vast evidence that most of them are AGP. So if you just look in M to F for like things like if you search for like euphoria boner, you find that like euphoria boners are incredibly common. Or if you type in like is it just a fetish? So it's like is it a fetish? You will find that like this is incredibly common. So like you have most of the online trans Redditors are on the autistic spectrum. And also most of them are dealing with this question of, is it a fetish? Why? because they've experienced arousal in association with cross-dressing or imagining themselves or fantasizing of being the opposite sex, which is the diagnostic criteria for being autogynephilic. So this idea that these, highly intelligent, gifted, exceptionally creative boys are not AGP, that's false. They are, most of them are AGP. So, yeah, they tend to be frequent users of social media and gaming platforms and often show a strong interest in anime. Some may be influenced by online pornography, but others display a marked lack of interest in, even distaste for male sexuality. Okay, so this idea that they show a lack of interest for male sexuality in their own bodies, that is also classic AGP. That is anatomical AGP. That is feeling that that is like part of the phenomenon of AGP. And also in the original Blanchardian typology, in terms of what sexual orientations are associated with a history of arousal at the thought of cross-dressing or fantasizing about being female, the asexual population was included as part of the AGP category. So it's not just having normal heterosexuality, it's also the asexual cohort was also talked about in terms of being AGP based on the evidence. Okay, so going back to, also one more thing I want to mention. If you search for paraphilia and autism on Google Scholar, there you'll find a ton of research showing that there's actually a connection between autism and an increased incidence of having paraphilias. So here's a study that was done, I think in like 2017, said altogether, paraphilic sexual fantasies and behaviors were reported more frequently in male patients with autism spectrum disorder than in male healthy controls. So there's a higher incidence of paraphilia in the autism spectrum cohort than in the healthy cohort. So that is also further evidence that, AGP and autism, these quirky, intelligent, sensitive boys, is not incompatible. So this whole idea that RGD boys are, somehow a third way, that they're not AGP, is just, there's no evidence for that. And the main motivation behind this is because these parents, these gender criticals, they want to sort of say that AGP is only creepy older fetishistic men, whereas these young boys, oh, they're so innocent, they couldn't possibly be, have AGP. So, and the perfect illustration of this is this paragraph here. So when given a choice of options to describe their son's pre-adolescent gender behavior, almost 90% selected masculine male but avoided contact sports, somewhat introverted. The remainder were identified as extremely masculine, and none were described as either feminine or extremely feminine. These boys absolutely do not fit the profile of HSTS as described by Blanchard. Whether they qualify instead as AGP has been hotly contested. While certain critics on X regularly denounce all trans-identified males, regardless of their age, as fetishistic perverts, that is, autogynephiles, and therefore unworthy of compassion or understanding, parents of trans-identified males are naturally unwilling to accept this description. Well, okay. So the problem with this is that you're saying that the phenomenon of AGP is just being a fetishistic pervert. Well, that's the problem. When you describe autogynephilia as fetishistic perversion, of course, parents aren't going to see that in their children. Well, that's why it's important to talk about autogynephilia in a more judgment neutral way. For example, the way Phil Illey talks about it as a inverted heterosexuality, as a sexual orientation. Because while it is true that autogynephilia can often manifest in a very fetishistic way, in a very perverted way, in a very disordered way, it doesn't always do that. It can just be sort of like an inverted heterosexuality. It is more akin to a sexual orientation than it is a disordered, a paraphilic phenomenon. So when you sort of say that, oh, well, autogynephilia is fetishistic perversion, and these young boys are not fetishistic perverts, therefore they don't have AGP, that's not proof that they're not AGP. That just means that you're mischaracterizing autogynephilia, and you're basing your understanding of autogynephilia on an outdated stereotype, which derives from these old stereotypes about, these perverted transvestites, back, 30 years ago, or whatever. But that is just simply not the case. And furthermore, you know, uh, yeah, I don't know. It's just like these parents probably also aren't looking at the child's like incognito browsers, like they're not like like unless you can monitor like all these children's online habits, like, there probably is, or if whether, like, these parents probably don't know whether their children are getting euphoria boners when they put on a skirt or steal their, mother's clothing or something like this. Because why? Because these boys don't talk about it because it's embarrassing. You don't talk about this stuff with your parents many of the time. So often these parents who are talking about their rapid onset boys, they don't know their boys. Like, parents do not always know everything that goes on in their child's life. um okay, so Burgo says, I don't believe these boys are all autogynephilic, although a small unknown number may go on to develop that condition. Instead, I see these lonely boys as full of self-loathing and desperate to identify out of their hated self. The story of how and why that might occur involves a condition I've called outsider shame, the sense that you're weird, defective, or damaged in a way that means that you don't belong, not anywhere, and never will. This has it reversed. The reason why they're weird, defective, or, damaged, or hate their self is because that, like, being AGP as a young male makes you weird. Having a desire to cross dress, like, makes you weird as a young boy. Identifying as a girl as a young boy makes you weird. That is why they hate themselves. They hate themselves because AGPs don't like their male bodies. They don't like being male. They don't like being masculine. But that's part of AGP. Like, part of AGP is feeling shame about being weird for the fact that you're a secret crossdresser, that you have this secretive history, or you identify as a girl or whatever. That's what makes you weird. It's not because you're like, lonely or whatever. It's like you're lonely because you have AGP. And he says, I believe the source of that shame can sometimes be found in a set of psychological traits that get lumped together as neurodivergence, encompassing autism spectrum disorder, attention, and ADHD. So sometimes the shame arises from being overly sensitive, awkward, or especially gifted in ways that make a child stand out in an unfavorable way. Okay, so the mere fact that they're sensitive and intelligent and awkward does not explain why their gender dysphoria manifests in a very specific way in regards to having dysphoria about their male sex body, having these desires to cross dress, and moreover, the fact that they're cross dressing leads to euphoria boners and this concern that's very extremely common of, like, is it just a fetish? And the autogynephilia, the inverted heterosexuality, is the only thing that explains the specific nature in which this phenomenon manifests. Just saying that they feel shame or that they're quirky does not explain the very specific dimensions that the gender dysphoria takes on in regards to this cross-sex fantasy, this AGP phenomenon, this fantasy about wanting to be the opposite sex. Only inverted heterosexuality explains that is why AGP is a good hypothesis, is because it can explain the specific nature of the phenomenon. Okay, so he's talking about like neurodivergence. It's not hard to understand why someone might want to identify out of a tormented self that feels defective and has been bullied by his peers. Well, he's bullied by his peers and tormented because you have AGP. Having AGP as a young male, as a young boy, it leads to self-torment because you want to be a girl, you fantasize about being a girl, you're confused about your sexuality because you like have this thing where like you are attracted to females, but you want to be female. That is confusing. It is confusing because all your other friends who are not AGP don't experience that. Your other friends are attracted to women and girls, but they don't want to be those things, whereas you do. That's what makes it weird. That's like why you like feel like a freak. That's why you hate yourself, because you can't embody the thing you want. You can't live out your fantasy. That's what makes you feel like lonely and isolated and different from like everyone else. In addition to being autistic, but none of that is like incompatible with like being AGP. So yeah, I don't know. A psychological approach to trans identification gains little traction in public debates about the issue. Instead, a simplified explanation is endlessly advanced by critics such as Kelly J. Keene. Trans-identified males are porn adult fetishists, and the entire phenomenon of men identifying as women can be accounted for by their addiction to pornography. I reject this theory, but believe we must nonetheless understand the influence that pornography does have upon a subset of these boys. Yes, I do reject this characterization by Kelly J. Keene that all these young AGP males are just porn adult fetishes. But that the problem is not to reject AGP as a theory. The thing you need to do is to recharacterize autogynephilia in a more judgment neutral way that characterizes it as a inverted as an inverted sexual orientation, to sort of destigmatize it so that you can properly understand the phenomenon. Because going to the psychological approach, there's not evidence for it. But the idea that AGP is just like fetishism is like mischaracterized, because that doesn't fully characterize the phenomenon. Okay, and then he gets into anime and pornography. These young boys are struggling with and confused by their testosterone-fueled sexuality. It seems both unkind and simple-minded to write them off as sexual perverts. Yes, because AGP is not just about sexual perversion. Because as people like Anne Lawrence have written about for so many years, AGP has both an erotic dimension, and it also has a romantic dimension. It both has an erotic dimension and a romantic dimension. It has sort of an emotional and attachment and romantic dimension. It's about falling in love with this idea. It's not simply about arousal. A arousal based perspective cannot fully explain the phenomenon. Just like in sexual orientation, if you are heterosexual, it doesn't mean that your entire heterosexuality is explained by you being horny all the time, because it is an inverted heterosexuality. But heterosexuality itself is not an entirely erotic phenomenon. There is also a romantic element, a emotional element to normal heterosexuality. So if AGP is an inverted heterosexuality, then it's also going to have both an erotic and a romantic component. Yeah, I don't know. That's pretty much like all I wanted to say for this article. Is comprehending the mysterious mental states of these boys may be difficult for those unfamiliar with neurodivergent or highly gifted and sensitive boys, but a combination of profound loneliness and shame holds the key. Well, you know what also leads to shame? Being autogynephilic. Having arousal leads to shame. Having euphoria boners leads to shame. Because if you look in the M2F subreddit for like euphoria boners, like one of the most common feelings is like shame. They feel shame and feeling these euphoria boners. It feels shameful to have arousal at the thought of being a woman or at cross-dressing. But it's not that the shame is causing them to be trans. It's the autogynephilia is leading them to be trans. But that's not to say that these other things can't play a factor. Yes, male loneliness, like not fitting in with masculinity, rejecting these gender roles, like hating your male self, all these things play a factor in why an AGP male might take on a trans identity. So I'm not dismissing everything Burgo is saying. I think Burgo is accurately describing the psychology of these young AGPs. It's just that it's not incompatible with them being AGP or having AGP. It's not a third way. It is just AGP set in the context of the young male experience in terms of, why it's more about why a young AGP takes on their trans identity, not like why there's a third way that's distinct from AGP. So I don't want to like totally dismiss everything that Burgo is saying, because he says like these boys have a deeply problematic relationship with masculinity. And so yeah, like, but that is compatible with AGP. That's not a third way. And that problematic relationship with masculinity explains why they take on the trans identity. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I just think this whole article is like confused, and it's fundamentally based on a stereotype of AGP as being like purely fetishistic or purely deviant. And once we recharacterize AGP as more akin to a sexual orientation and not just a paraphilic disorder, we, we can like properly understand this phenomenon. Okay, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Take care.